So, one of the wonderful things about mushrooms is that unless you're allergic to mushrooms, they're pretty much something that is safe for everyone. They can be used by children, they can be used by animals, and the fact that they have a lot of compounds that are only available in mushrooms. The more that they're being studied, the more that people are seeing that actually they do numerous things. The main thing that any mushroom that you eat, whether it's a culinary mushroom or a medicinal mushroom, on some level it's going to be helping to modulate the immune system, and that means that it's helping to either raise immunity when needed and also lower immunity when needed.
If you had to pick one mushroom that supports the gut, what would your go-to be?
So lion's mane would be the main one that we would think of. It's amazing what it can do, and its one level is the fact that it really helps with rebalancing the gut microbiota, but another aspect of it is that it actually stimulates something called nerve growth factor, which then encourages the growth of nerve cells. There was even a period in the 80s in Japan where they were using a particular mushroom as primary chemotherapy because one of the certain active compounds was actually having an anti-tumor effect.
Hello and welcome to the CNM Specialist Podcast with me, Bobby Qureshi, CNM's Director of Education. Today I'm delighted to welcome Hania Opienski. Hania is a naturopathic nutritionist, traditional Chinese medicine acupuncturist, and energy medicine specialist. She applies a holistic approach to health using a synergy of natural Eastern, Western, and energy medicine to facilitate the highest expression of well-being and balance for her clients. She is the education lead and a medicinal mushroom specialist consultant for Hifas, Terra, UK and Ireland. In today's podcast, we'll be looking at the most therapeutic mushrooms available to us, how we can use them, and their benefits in areas such as the immune system, for gut health, and also for cancer. Thank you so much for joining us today, Hania.
Welcome, great to be here.
So I'm really interested to hear, where did your interest in natural medicine begin? And also, of course, where did your interest in mushrooms come from?
Okay, well, my interest in natural medicine came from my parents. So when I was a baby, when I was sick, I was given some antibiotics and I got more sick from that. And so my parents decided they wanted to explore alternative medicine. And so I grew up using homeopathy and then being introduced to other forms of natural medicine. So it was always something that was quite normal and accessible for me. And then after a bit of a health crash in my 20s, I decided to retrain, and acupuncture was one of the things that had been really helpful in my recovery. And so I decided to study acupuncture initially. And then once I'd been working with that for a while, and finding that the nutritional advice that I was giving my clients from a Chinese medicine perspective was really helpful. And I thought, well, actually, I'd like to understand nutrition more. And then when I was looking into courses, I found that actually naturopathy, which combined herbal medicine and nutrition, was something that sounded really interesting. And I decided to study in Australia. So I went and did naturopathy there. And then in my course as part of herbal medicine, we touched on mushrooms a little bit, but we were kind of looking at them from a Western perspective and in herbal tinctures and used in combination with Western herbs. So I just kind of had a bit of an introduction there, but didn't really, mycotherapy, which is the use of mushrooms as their own therapy, just without herbs or nutrition, or in parallel with herbs and nutrition. It wasn't something that I was aware of at that point. When I moved back to the UK, I started working for a supplement company, and I was as a rep working in Whole Foods and Planet Organic, and it was a way for me to learn the whole scene in the UK because I had studied in Australia and then worked in the Maldives and Thailand, so I didn't really know the UK supplement natural health market and all the products. And while I was doing that, I started learning about the different brands, and I started getting more interested in medicinal mushrooms. And I, was looking at everything that was available and who were the research-based companies. And that's when I first learned about Hifas. And I found that they were doing primary research and was a supplement company based on research rather than just on products. And so when the opportunity came up to work with them, I jumped at the chance, and I've been continuing to learn more about mushrooms as I've worked for them for the last 5-6 years.
That's amazing. And I think it's good to highlight that this is an area that we're really learning more about all the time. You know, this is evolving very quickly. You mentioned a term there, mycotherapy. So just explain that to our listeners, because of course, as practitioners, we call this mycotherapy. But if you could just elaborate, that would be great.
Certainly. So mycotherapy is the term myco meaning mushroom, therapy. So it's the use of mushrooms as medicinal or health-giving substances, and particularly applied to human health.
Excellent. Well explained. In terms of mushrooms, I think a lot of people listening will probably be thinking, well, are the mushrooms in my cupboard medicinal mushrooms? So could you just explain what we mean by medicinal mushrooms and what the different sort of types of mushrooms are, basically?
Yeah, so there is actually a crossover between culinary and medicinal mushrooms, and there's certainly some what we would class medicinal mushrooms that people probably are familiar with. So something like shiitake, as we get more used to Asian food, it's something that probably most people will have heard of or even eaten, and that's something that's also been used traditionally, medicinally for thousands of years as well. And so that would be one that crosses over. And actually, the common, everyday button mushroom, it's part of the agaricus family, and one of the main mushrooms that Hifas works with, Agaricus blazei-meril, is a particular, it's like a cousin of the one that, the white mushrooms or brown mushrooms that people would eat every day, that just has higher levels of certain active compounds, which therefore we consider it medicinal. But even eating everyday mushrooms, you're actually getting lower doses of a lot of the therapeutic compounds, and that would go for actually pretty much all of the culinary mushrooms have some of these key compounds that are really useful. Just if we're using them medicinally, we'd probably use them in higher quantities than people would be eating on a daily basis. And
I guess some of the medicinal mushrooms that we talk about just have certain compounds that are more kind of the potent therapeutic compounds, just in higher dosages. Is that what kind of makes them medicinal? Yeah,
and it's also like some of the medicinal mushrooms are ones that, would have been traditionally used in herbal medicine and aren't culinary. So something like reishi, it actually has, it's very hard. So it has a lot of this insoluble fiber. So actually, if you ever see a real reishi mushroom, it's like if you knock on it, it'll sound, like the wooden table. You couldn't actually eat it. So the only way it could be consumed is if you ground it up, boiled it as a tea. So there's a number of medicinal mushrooms that are only able to be used if you're preparing them. Whereas, the culinary mushrooms, we can still prepare them into a powder, an extract, but you could, eat a shiitake mushroom, you could eat lion's mane, but something like reishi, it's only usable in a medicinal form.
Right. And you've mentioned a couple of locations, predominantly Asia here. Are most medicinal mushrooms, am I right to say, found in Asia, or do we find much, for example, where we are here in Europe?
So it's a mixture. I mean, I think Asian medicine has a longer tradition of using mushrooms medicinally or more kind of overtly, but there is evidence, things like chaga, lion's mane, the oyster mushrooms, maitake, all of these are actually, indigenous to Europe as well. And some of them are things that, you could find if you, got into a foraging group. And definitely in North America, a lot of the mushrooms are available. And even now people are growing reishi, in the UK, it is possible. But I think in terms of herbal medicine in the UK and Europe, I think in Siberian medicine and a couple of the sort of older medicines, they did use some mushrooms, but it wasn't so emphasized. Whereas in Chinese medicine, mushrooms are in like the earliest ever, medicinal texts from hundreds of, or even thousands of years ago. They actually include mushrooms from that date. So there's a more trackable history of that.
Makes complete sense. So we've got lots to talk about, and I'm really interested to talk about what the key mushrooms are, your favorite mushrooms, the most therapeutic ones, and basically what they do for us, and of course how we can use them. But I think a good place to start, just to really start from the sort of the bottom and work our way up, is just to explain really what a mushroom is. So if you could start from there, that would be amazing.
Yeah. So mushrooms actually have their own kingdom. So we have the animal kingdom, the plant kingdom. There's also the fungal kingdom. So mushroom actually, if you're being technical, that actually just applies to what we would call the fruiting body of a fungus, which is the bit that we think of as a mushroom. But actually the whole, plant, the fungal equivalent is actually a fungi. And in the same kingdom, we also have yeasts and microfungi. So the kind that we would use therapeutically and in a culinary way, we call macrofungi, which just means the big ones. And then there are microfungi, which are things like even at the other end of the scale, things like mycotoxins, which are completely different. So when we're talking about mushrooms, ideally you would actually be using the fruiting body, but what would be the equivalent to a plant of roots, which is called the mycelium, there's also some therapeutic compounds in here, and the spores, which are the equivalent of the seeds. So if people are actually looking at mushroom products, you'll find that some of them will say they're full spectrum biomass, some will say fruiting body, some will say mycelium, right. Some will say spore, and these are basically just referring to different parts of the mushroom that are being used.
And is there a particular part that's most therapeutic, or does it not really work like that?
Well, in a way, it's like, if you think of a plant, in some cases, we would use the bark of a tree. In some cases, we would use the leaves or the roots. But, the fruit would be the thing that is actually kind of carrying the most nutrients, the most life, is the thing that's designed to be consumed to actually then propagate the species. So ideally, you would use a fruiting body product. And that's the thing that it takes the longest to grow. It's going to have the highest concentration of active compounds. And so that would be ideal. But in some cases and some mushrooms, we would use the mycelium because there are some mushrooms that actually, like Cordyceps, that I think we'll talk about, is actually what they call an entomopathogenic mushroom. And what that means is that in order for the fruiting body to sprout, it actually eats into an insect. And so it needs that host in order to actually create a fruiting body. So most mushroom companies, unless they're wildcrafting Cordyceps, they want to make vegan products. They don't want to be sacrificing thousands of insects. Right. So pretty much all Cordyceps products you'll see on the market will just be the mycelium, because that you can propagate without having to, kill insects.
They are quite quirky looking mushrooms, Cordyceps, aren't they? I must say.
They are
I think
odd.
Anyone listening, just have a little Google search right now of Cordyceps. I remember when we were doing some of our lecture material on mushrooms, and I was sourcing some images, and I was sort of like, is this it, really? I think actually that they are generally beautiful things, maybe not so much Cordyceps, but otherwise, lion's mane, reishi, they are absolutely stunning mushrooms. And I think people are always blown away by how beautiful they are. So it's really nice that they're starting to get some attention here, I feel, because it's very much deserved. And I guess really we need to talk about why they're getting the attention, because from our perspective as practitioners, we use them because of their amazing therapeutic benefits. So what makes, how do they exert such great benefits, and what are the benefits we get from them?
Yeah. So, one of the wonderful things about mushrooms is that unlike a lot of herbal medicines, which, maybe you can just use for a short amount of time, or they might have interactions with medications, or they might have, active compounds that are useful in the short term, but if you take them for too long, then they can have a negative effect on the body. Mushrooms, unless you're allergic to mushrooms, so if you can't eat food mushrooms, you can't have medicinal mushrooms. But other than that, they're pretty much something that is safe for everyone. They can be used by children, they can be used by animals, and they're, we could call them a functional food, although they're also used as a herbal medicine. So they kind of cover those two, areas. So a nutritionist can comfortably use them, but also a herbal medicine practitioner or a naturopath can use them. And then, of course, in the traditional Asian herbal medicine traditions, they are used. So safety is an amazing thing. The fact that they can be used long term, and the fact that they have a lot of compounds that are only available in mushrooms, and the more that they're being studied, the more that people are seeing that actually they do numerous things. And the main thing that any mushroom that you eat, whether it's a culinary mushroom or a medicinal mushroom, on some level it's going to be helping to modulate the immune system. And that means that it's helping to either raise immunity when needed and also lower immunity when needed. And that's really important, because I think historically people thought mushrooms were just immune stimulants, and that then limits, because say if someone has an autoimmune condition, you don't want to stimulate the immune system. So there's a lot of really useful immune herbs that you just can't use in someone with an autoimmune condition. Whereas because mushrooms have this modulating effect, you can help someone who's, recovering from a virus or is kind of chronically getting coughs and colds and has to take, medication because they have an autoimmune condition which is suppressing their immunity. You could then give this person a mushroom and know that it's going to be supporting them with their sort of coughs and colds without actually counteracting their medicine that is, helping keep their autoimmune condition in check.
I think that's a really good explanation, and highlighting that they are immune modulating. So, we always think with the immune system, don't we, that if it's underactive, it's a problem because you can get sick. If it's overactive, it's a problem because we end up with autoimmunity and allergies. So it is about getting that balance, and we want to make sure we're optimally functioning here. So I guess what the mushrooms do is they kind of bring us back to that level of balance. And that's nice. You've also highlighted a great point there, which is, of course, about safety, because, of course, this is something we always should be very much aware of. I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Hifas have actually conducted some research to look at safety in terms of the interactions with medications. And they basically found that the main route that drugs are detoxified by, mushrooms don't interact with. So they're not broken down. They're not going to influence that same pathway. So is that sort of explaining why we know with medications they're generally regarded as safe?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you have to be careful when you're choosing a mushroom product, because there can actually be other ingredients in a mushroom product or something in the production that may mean that that specific product is going to have an interaction. So you always want to check, if you are, using a mushroom product, that company is saying this is safe to be used alongside your medication. And so, Hifas wanted to, one of the key areas of research and product development and creation is in integrative oncology. And so, of course, if someone's going through primary, cancer care and they're taking, chemotherapy, immunotherapy, you want to make sure that anything that you're recommending is going to be safe and not interacting. So Hifas did a trial on their concentrated extracts, or actually a third-party organization, the Medina Foundation. They did a trial using Hifas extracts, and they found, exactly as you said, that this liver detoxification pathway, that the mushrooms weren't interrupting that, which means that they're not going to interrupt the metabolism of drugs that use that pathway. And that was geared towards looking at these, heavy-duty drugs, but also applies to all the other drugs that, we use that also use that pathway. So Hifas products, have that research and that safety. But I would say that doesn't necessarily apply to all mushroom products. So if you'd want to check in with a company before just thinking, oh yeah, mushrooms are safe, I can use them.
And I think actually a really interesting thing, I don't know if this is now the case, but I read a research paper from about 3 years ago. And they basically looked at a group of supplements that were claimed to be medicinal mushrooms. And quite alarmingly, in 75% of the products, there was actually no medicinal mushroom in there. None. I think they were looking at reishi. But even that alone, obviously this is now a big industry. It is important to make sure that you're getting good quality products that actually have in there what they're claiming to have in there. So I guess, being cautious that we're looking for quality and making sure, as you said, that there's no extra ingredients in that could be a problem for the individual, and that it's a well-respected company, I guess, is key. You've also mentioned integrative oncology. So could you just explain, I know Hifas, you sort of specialize in this, you're doing a lot of research in this area, but just sort of explain for our listeners what you mean by that.
Yeah, I'd love to. But is it okay if I just go back to your previous comment? Because what you said there about that research paper is actually really important when people are choosing a supplement, because I don't think it's the case in Europe, but in the States, there is a kind of like legal loophole with mushrooms that allowed that to be the case, where basically as soon as you put, like, a lot of mushrooms, like mushrooms traditionally would grow, the medicinal ones mainly grow on wood, and so what that means is that it's easy to harvest the fruiting body, but the mycelium, the roots, are going to be sort of embedded into wood chips, and so you wouldn't use that. But of course, it's mushrooms, like most things, feed on carbohydrates. So growing a mushroom on a grain means it's going to grow much faster, and you're going to get a faster yield. And because grain is something that can be consumed, it means you can use the mycelium, the roots, with some of the grain in there.
Right.
And so it means that then you actually bulk out your product. It's faster and cheaper. And in the States, there's basically a ruling that as soon as you put mushroom spores into grain, it's then legally classed as 100% mushroom. And that's why, this was published in Nature, which is, one of the most important journals. And basically what they were finding is because of this this legal loophole, companies were, sort of putting spores into their grain medium and then creating products from that, whether the spores actually developed into mushrooms or mycelium or not. And so really, when you're choosing a mushroom product, you really want to look at, if it says something like biomass, full spectrum biomass, if it's a grain grown product, then it means you don't actually know what proportion of that product is actually mushroom, what proportion is mycelium, what proportion is grain. And as this study showed, actually 75% of those mushrooms on the market were actually pretty much just grain and no mushroom. And so it is really important that people know what to look for, because if you're, uneducated to this, it can say 100% reishi, and legally it is, but actually in the ingredients, if it's been reishi grown on grain, then it could actually be just a tiny fraction of reishi or none at all. Yeah. So that's really important.
It's a really great point. It's almost like with the supplement industry generally, you might have a very cheap vitamin C that's full of excipients and basically rubbish that's got maybe 10 milligrams of vitamin C in there, which is going to do absolutely nothing for you. So it is important that we look for quality, and I guess ultimately this is why certain supplements will be more expensive, certain products will be more expensive. Exactly. Just go back to the integrative oncology.
So integrative oncology is a really interesting field. So, as we've sort of mentioned about mushrooms being used in Asian medicines for a long time. And so they actually are probably further ahead than in the West in terms of looking at mushrooms for oncology. There was even a period in the 80s in Japan where they were using a particular mushroom as primary chemotherapy, because one of the certain active compounds was actually having an anti-tumor effect. Now mushrooms are something that tend to be used integratively rather than as a standalone, and that would be what Hifas is promoting as well. And that's because even though there is some evidence that mushrooms can actually have an anti-cancer effect, interrupt that whole process of the cell change and tumor development, but actually one of the key things that mushrooms do is this protecting the immune system. And so what they're doing is, while someone is having this very challenging treatment, it can actually be supporting the individual in maintaining a certain level of quality of life, in maintaining a certain level of weight, of energy, of managing nausea, of managing immunity, so they're not necessarily catching other things while their immunity is weak from the treatment. They can also help with things like reducing the loss of taste or reducing the loss of hair, and in some cases, because of this improved quality of life, it means that people can finish a course. One of the things that I don't know whether it's so kind of commonly known, but because chemotherapy can be such a debilitating treatment, often people can't complete full courses because of the side effects, because they're finding it so challenging. Whereas using a mushroom product alongside, because it's improving the quality of life, it means that it can support someone in actually finishing a whole course of treatment and getting the full benefit of their primary treatment, whilst actually being more comfortable, having a better quality of life, and then supporting with maintaining remission.
It's amazing that these compounds can do that, these mushrooms can do that. And so basically what we're saying is that they can improve efficacy, so they're helping with efficacy of treatment based on research, but also that they're reducing side effects, which of course is a huge problem when it comes to conventional cancer treatments. And of course, if we just think in simple terms what chemotherapy is doing, it's basically targeting any cell in your body that's quickly dividing. That of course includes cancer cells, but it also includes a lot of healthy cells, your cells in your bone marrow, like your red blood cells, like your white blood cells, so your immune system, cells involved in the hair, hence people losing hair, cells in the gut, hence gut problems. So this is amazing that we've got something here that we can use to make that more targeted and reduce side effects. You also mentioned there with Japan, is that turkey tail you were talking about?
Yeah, that's right. That was turkey tail, called Coriolis. Yeah.
Coriolis, right. And it's named turkey tail. We can talk a bit more about this too. It's called turkey tail, isn't it? Because of the sort of the lineage that you get, the appearance of the mushroom. It looks literally as such.
Yeah, it actually grows like a fan, and then it has like different colours going out, so it actually looks like a fanned turkey tail.
Wow.
So that's the common name. It's quite bright colours, so yeah.
It's another beautiful one to add to the list.
Yeah.
So in terms of cancer progression, what we know is that there is some evidence to say that it can assist in terms of the sort of the cell cycle that we associate with cancer. What do we know about this at the moment? So there is some evidence to say that it can actually stop tumor progression?
Yeah, I mean, there is, small trials, sort of cell studies, some animal studies, some small human studies. And there's actually, numerous, actually pretty much every step along the pathway from that, stopping the cellular change to stopping or reducing angiogenesis, which is the production of blood vessels so that the tumor can actually feed itself and keep growing, reducing tumor size. What else? There's some evidence also of there's a process that's called programmed cell death, which is when the body actually kills off cells that are damaged. Like in cancer, that's one of the mechanisms that stops working, so these damaged cells can keep growing. There's also evidence that mushrooms can actually switch that back on, so they can amazingly tell the body, this is an unhealthy cell, kill it off. This is a healthy cell, let's make it healthier. So like all of these different stages, there's small evidence that mushrooms actually support each of these steps. And it's some mushrooms will have an effect on all of these things, but a lot of mushrooms, there'll be certain mushrooms that do this or certain mushrooms that do this better in certain tissues of the body. And so ideally in an integrative oncology product, you want one that's a synergistic combination, a blend of different mushrooms. And then and ideally one that's actually targeted towards the specific type of cancer that you have, because there are certain mushrooms that are kind of supportive across the board, and then there are certain mushrooms that have what we call a tropism, which means like an attraction to a specific system or organ in the body. And so then using those specific mushrooms is going to give you an enhanced benefit than just using those ones that have a general benefit.
So just on this, whilst we're on topic, what would your kind of go-to mushrooms be when you're supporting somebody that's got a diagnosis of cancer?
Yeah, so I mean, these days I would use the Hifas combinations, because they've created 5 blends which are targeted to the main types of cancer. And so the key mushrooms that are in all of those blends are something called sun mushroom, or Agaricus blazei moril, reishi, that we've mentioned a couple of times, which is the specific strain is Ganoderma lucidum, and the other is maitake, which is Grifola frondosa. So these are the kind of 3 mushrooms that are key in the blend, and then depending on which condition, there are 2 or 3 other mushrooms added. And there's sort of evidence coming back either from people that I've supported or people that practitioners who ask for advice from Hifas and work with Hifas mushrooms, is using those tailored blends is actually really making a difference in supporting people.
That's amazing.
And so, and the other key thing that's really important is mushrooms are what we call dose dependent. And what that means is the worse the condition or the bigger the person, the higher the dose of mushrooms needed to have a therapeutic effect. So when we're working with oncology, then you really need really high doses. And again, from kind of Asian research, people were mostly just using mushroom powders, or some cases extracts, and they were finding that people were having to take kind of 15, 30, extract capsules a day, or 50, 100 whole mushroom powder capsules. And of course, if you've got nausea, if you're taking other medications, that becomes really hard for people to do. And so Hifas decided that they wanted to make a liquid supplement, so that's going to increase ease of use, and it's going to increase, how regularly people are actually taking it. Because again, that regularity of use makes a difference. You want those mushrooms in your system so that you actually get a steady state, of those active compounds. So you're taking it once or twice a day. throughout a course of treatment, and then you're going to get the best benefits. And so now, a liquid vial from one of the oncology lines is like the equivalent of 200 or so capsules of just a mushroom powder, or like 20 or 30 of a concentrated extract. So again, you're really needing these high doses, but of course you want it in a form that's going to be actually feasible to take and not as expensive as buying hundreds of powder capsules.
Makes perfect sense. You've actually really highlighted a good point, which is about dosage, because of course, as with anything, it is about dosage as well as quality, and you need to make sure you're getting the right dosage to have a therapeutic effect. And this is where sometimes people will come in to see us as practitioners saying, well, I did try, this vitamin or this nutrient and it didn't really work, but sometimes it's simply a case of just an inadequate dosage. So it's good that you're highlighting that for this sort of effect that you're trying to achieve, you need to be working in very high dosages. I also read some studies, I think it was one particular paper this was referring to, that spoke about how some mushrooms in particular have quite a strong prebiotic effect in the gut, which basically means that it feeds the gut bacteria, for those listening, and that mechanism is also good for some types of cancers, like bowel cancer, for example. Is that something that you know much about?
Yeah, so as you say, it is a kind of an emerging area of research, and one of the key active ingredients in mushrooms is beta-glucans, and these are a type of polysaccharide, which is like a long chain sugar, and they do have this immune modulating effect and a number of other effects, but they also have a prebiotic effect. And actually there's a couple of research trials that Hifas is doing at the moment, one in colon cancer, one in breast cancer. And they're both actually, and particularly the breast cancer trial, actually looking at the impact of mushrooms on the microbiome, because now it's being recognized that actually, dysbiosis, or this kind of lack of balance or ill health in the gut bacteria, actually being a risk factor or a precursor to cancer development. And so they're looking at, how these mushroom prebiotics, how that is actually part of the mechanism of how they're helpful in actually bringing the gut back into balance as part of the healing process, and not just looking at the immune modulating effect and how the immune system can be self-regulating or kind of working at fighting against the cancer. So it's this kind of dual approach. So definitely a really interesting area.
Cutting edge stuff. And I think the great thing is we're actually starting to make that connection now between the gut microbiome and cancer development. Obviously, it's very early days. We don't know much about this yet, so we certainly cannot make any claims. But I think it's been hypothesized for many years now that there must be some connection, and we're starting to get evidence to suggest so. So this sort of evidence is really interesting, because it does make sense from a sort of mechanistic perspective when you think about what the gut microbiome is doing and how that could potentially feed into the development of cancerous cells, etc. So really interesting. And of course, if we just think from a general gut perspective, if we're dealing with somebody that's got dysbiosis without any other sort of ongoing illness, that shows that mushrooms could have a good benefit there in terms of supporting the health of a good microbiome.
Yeah, definitely. And one of the nice things that I found is that I don't know whether you found this as well, but there are certain prebiotics that can actually create a lot of bloating or discomfort while the body is kind of getting used to that change in bacteria. Whereas, I don't think we've ever had feedback at Hifas, and I certainly haven't from anyone I've worked with, of mushrooms even at, high powder doses or high concentrated extract doses ever really getting any of that discomfort. So they're a really kind of easy prebiotic that they have the effect. Like, so, again, Hifas has done some case studies and looked at, the people's microbiome and the kind of the balance of bacteria pre-use at 3 months, at 6 months, at 9 months, and the change in, the gut microbiome and the balancing of, getting rid of the bad ones, increasing the good ones, and also some that, like acupuncturist species, which is, I think now people are actually starting to make supplements, but for a long time it was something that couldn't be done because it's so, unstable, that actually, just taking a prebiotic, can help the body to create its own. And so it's amazing.
Great. Let's talk about the acupuncturist, because it's a good connection. Acupuncturist, for those who are listening, we regard it as kind of a keystone bacteria in our gut microbiome. It's one of those bacterial species that if we ever do a stool test, we're always looking to see, is it there? Is it present? In excess, it's all about balance. In excess, it could be a problem, but most people don't have it. And the main place we get it from is breast milk. Interestingly, probably a bit too much detail, but I did a stool test a couple of years ago, and probably about 18 months ago now. And on my stool test, there was no akkermansia, which is kind of fit in with the symptoms I was getting. And at the time, my wife was pregnant, and she always made the joke. She's like, I'm going to get you drinking my breast milk. That will give you akkermansia. And since then, luckily, I didn't need to go down that route. As much as I appreciated the offer. Since then, we've learned that we can feed any akkermansia that is there, even if it's in tiny amounts, with the prebiotics and get them growing. And the reason this is such a key bacteria is because it keeps the mucus lining in your gut nice and healthy. So if there isn't enough, there's a chance that we can sort of have a very thin layer of mucus, and we get a little bit too much crosstalk between the contents of the gut and the immune system. We can start having lots of inflammation, which obviously isn't a good thing. So that's really interesting. And what I really like what you highlighted there was how this is a prebiotic that doesn't typically bloat you, because you are right. This is one of the biggest issues we face as practitioners when if somebody's got an overgrowth of certain bacteria, one of the ways that we can approach this is to try and feed the healthy bacteria. But the issue is that a lot of prebiotics feed both. So the bad ones there will try and steal it all. So you just bloat because you get lots of gas. So it's really powerful, actually, that these are substances that we can use that are very kind of friendly in cases of dysbiosis. So that's really interesting you highlighted that.
Yeah. And I mean, I would say, like, say if someone has a candida overgrowth, you'd probably be better off using a mushroom extract than a mushroom powder, because there is the possibility that that increased level of prebiotic fiber in a whole powder might initially, as you said, feed the good and the bad. But we found that the concentrated extracts where, you know, you haven't got so much of the kind of bulking fiber that would be in a mushroom, and you just have these kind of therapeutically active fibers like the beta glucans and maybe some alpha glucans, but that actually that can, as you said, just be feeding the good ones and not kind of propagating those things that we don't want, so that it can be something that gets someone back to a level of, you know, getting out of dysbiosis and into balance. And then it might be that you want to use a whole mushroom powder because they're not getting any fiber in their diet and they need that extra. But yeah, as you said, it can be used much more comfortably without sort of adding into the imbalance.
Amazing. And now I'm going to ask you this question. I feel like I know what the answer will be. I hope it is this answer. But I want to talk more about this mushroom soon. But if you had to pick one mushroom that supports the gut, what would your go-to be?
Yeah, well, I think you've already, so lion's mane would be the main one that we would think of. And there is quite a lot of research on lots of different aspects of this. But yeah, it's definitely, it's amazing what it can do. And it's one level is the fact that it really helps with rebalancing the gut microbiota. But another aspect of it is that it actually stimulates something called nerve growth factor, which then encourages the growth of nerve cells. So, you talked about, when the gut gets irritated, the lining is thin, and then that can then cause some, sort of, I think you said crosstalk between what's inside and what's outside. So we could call that some leaky gut. And one of the great things with lion's mane is that it doesn't just balance the gut bacteria, which helps with healing the gut lining, but also it actually helps heal the whole enteric nervous system, the nervous system in the gut, as well as peripheral and central nervous system. So it's actually supporting this whole gut-brain axis and helping to heal the lining of the gut much more efficiently than just a prebiotic that might be helping with the imbalance. It's also encouraging, healthy tissue growth, and particularly this nervous tissue in the gut as well.
Thank you for explaining. Really well explained. It is an amazing connection. And, like you've said, we can use it to support the gut barrier. So if there's permeability problems, which is, very common, we can use it to support cases of dysbiosis, extremely common. And you mentioned that gut-brain connection. I mean, this again is a really hot topic. We know so much now about how, an imbalance in the gut can have an imbalance in the brain, basically, to put it simply. If we have, put it in simple terms, leaky gut or dysbiosis in the gut, we're more likely to have problems associated with the brain. That could be various different things. But it's amazing we've got a mushroom here that covers both areas. I mean, lion's mane for me, total geek around lion's mane. I love this mushroom. My students, I think, wind me up because I'm always like, lion's mane could probably work for that. It's a great mushroom. And again, another one to Google image, I think, isn't it? I mean, the appearance. Tell the listeners about the appearance of this amazing mushroom.
Yeah, so it's not kind of, if you think of a mushroom, this is not at all the image that you would get. So it's basically like another one of the names that I think the English common name is bearded tooth mushroom, and that kind of gives you an idea. It's like it basically has all of these tiny little filaments. So the fruiting body, instead of being like a solid, smooth mass, it has all of these tiny little hairs that actually look like a lion's mane, and it tends to grow sort of on the side or underneath things. So you get these amazing kind of waterfalls, and it's sort of very white, sometimes slightly yellow, but it's really beautiful and pristine. And very attractive mushroom.
And it is edible, isn't it?
Yeah, no, luckily I've actually managed to get it at my local farmer's market in the last couple of years. So it's delicious. If you ever get a chance to try lion's mane, I really recommend it. It's almost like kind of vegan lobster.
Right.
It's very sweet and subtle and quite soft textured. Really, really good.
Amazing. I've used lion's mane actually. I like to use lion's mane for general nerve related problems. So for example, if I've got somebody that has had a nerve injury, or patients that have had a stroke, for example, or one of my patients recently has motor neurone disease, it's really interesting because there is a lot of research talking about the specific compounds in lion's mane that promote nerve growth factor. So we actually know quite a lot about it. And it can help, if I'm not mistaken, even with the myelination, which is the coating around our nerves that kind of helps our nerves to transmit. Of course, we lose myelin, we lose that coating in conditions like multiple sclerosis. So although, as far as I'm aware, there's not, big kind of research pointing out that, yes, we can use it for this treatment, but certainly from a physiological perspective, there is a potential there that with some more studies would be really interesting to delve into.
Yeah, I totally agree. Exactly. I mean, there's definitely evidence that, the active compounds, the hericinones and erinacines, these are kind of key active compounds in lion's mane, that they will have this remyelination effect, that they will stimulate nerve growth factor, that they will stimulate other chemicals in the brain that are to do with mood management as well as nervous system healing. So it kind of works, lion's mane is for neurological, healing, reducing degeneration, maintenance, but also for mood management. As you say, not very much research or human studies have been done yet, but there's really good potential there because the mechanisms, we know that this happens, and that there is some studies, like you mentioned, talking about nerve injuries. There's animal studies of using lion's mane and it helping with regenerating peripheral nerves and like hind leg injury, and there's definitely evidence that shows this is a really interesting area of research.
Amazing, really amazing. And I think this is where at the moment we're at that point with this sort of mushroom where we're sort of going, well, we know the potential mechanisms, we know the actions. Yes, we don't have extremely strong evidence for this yet if we look at kind of scientific research, but there is suggestions there, and obviously us as clinicians, we're using them and we're seeing how it works based on that mechanism. And we're obviously not promising the world to our patients, we're just saying let's see how it goes, and we're keeping it very simple. But we're seeing the benefits, aren't we, in clinic? I remember having one patient actually where it really stands out from me, who it was quite an unfortunate one, really. It was actually a post-vaccine injury, and this guy was in his mid-50s, had his first COVID vaccine, and literally within almost hours he was starting to decline, and then the next day he developed severe tingling and numbness, and he basically started to develop gradual paralysis. There was a query. He went to the hospital. They didn't know what it was. They sort of thought, is it, they acknowledged that this is what it is. It's an injury post-vaccination. But they didn't know whether it was a condition called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which for those listening is sort of where your immune system attacks the nervous system, basically. But they said, look, we don't know what it is. He sort of calmed down a bit, came in to see me, and it really was just in a bad way. Had power loss in his muscles, tingling, really not in a good place. And the first substance I thought of was, well, let's try lion's mane. Again, didn't promise him anything at all. The response he had was unbelievable. I mean, within 2 months, he was virtually symptom-free. And it was amazing. Obviously, there were different things we were using, but that was a key part of my protocol on the basis of some of what we know. And who knows? We don't know for sure. There's no certainty here, of course, whether it was that or other things. He might have just resolved otherwise. But I think from what I saw, that might have been why. So it's interesting. And I know a lot of practitioners that use lion's mane and other mushrooms and get similar effects, maybe where the research is, but it just shows so much promise for potential for the future for how we might use these.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I was thinking about one of the cases that kind of stood out for me was also with lion's mane and a patient who had Crohn's, and which is a disease of the inflammatory bowel disease where, the lining of the gut kind of gets eaten away. And, and she had kind of scans and had, quite a lot of lesions, in her gut. And the doctors were really pushing for her to have Western treatment. And, I helped her change her diet, and she was taking a range of supplements, and it was kind of managing her symptoms and reducing it. And then, I decided, well, she needed to give up smoking, which she did, and we introduced lion's mane. And then I think it was even just 3 months later when she had her next scan, basically they said, you're in complete remission. Wow. And so, I'm sure this, like stopping smoking was a major part of it. But, we started with the lion's mane powder and then a concentrated extract. And, and she was taking that and, her gut completely healed. So amazing. I think that combination of taking out a trigger factor, putting something in that helped the body to heal faster. And, and she's managed to sort of maintain, that remission since then with kind of looking after her stress, not going back to smoking. Yeah. But yeah, it's made a massive difference.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing. It's a very powerful mushroom. And I think, if we haven't sold lion's mane by now, Hania, I don't know what else we could do. We should probably talk about another mushroom. Let's think of other areas, because we've spoken about the immune system. We've spoken about its potential role in cancer. We've spoken about the gut-brain axis, gut-brain connection. What other things do we use medicinal mushrooms for?
Well, I mean, in a way, you can kind of use them for most things. They're, as well as being, immune modulating, there are a number of mushrooms, like we talked a bit about lion's mane, but those that manage the central nervous system. So something like reishi, it is one of the most immunomodulating mushrooms, but it's also known as a nervous system balancer. So it's something that, has been used in traditional medicine for sleep, stress, anxiety, depression, pain, for millennia. And now there is research, in each of these areas. And it's one that is kind of known for calming the nervous system and for helping to sort of slow down or reduce the stress response. So that's one that, is a really useful one. And the other kind of key thing, like, if you look at any of the traditional mentions of reishi, it's considered the mushroom of eternal youth. And that's because one of the key things that it does is it's an anti-inflammatory and antioxidant. I think actually it's possibly one of the most potent antioxidants out there. And so, of course, what that is doing is, oxidation and inflammation are two of the things that cause cellular aging. Taking reishi preventatively is going to be one of those things that is reducing inflammation and oxidation in the body. So from a longevity point of view, it's a wonderful mushroom. But then if you have any conditions where oxidation or inflammation are an issue, which is pretty much all Western diseases, or living in a city and being stressed and breathing polluted air, it's also going to be having a counterbalancing effect there. Wow.
I mean, the mushroom of eternal youth. Again, you've sold that one. So it's sort of a healthy aging mushroom. We can think of it that way. And fantastic what you've just described there. So this is good for nervous system conditions. I recently used this actually on a patient of mine that's got really severe anxiety. And because it's also, if I'm not mistaken, reishi is an adaptogen.
Exactly.
Do you want to explain what an adaptogen is?
Yeah, so basically an adaptogen is something that helps the body adapt to stress. And there are a number of herbal adaptogens, but reishi is probably the best known of the mushroom adaptogens, although actually all mushrooms have a degree of an adaptogenic function. And that, again, like this immunomodulating effect, it means that it's not just going to have a calming effect. It's going to have this adaptive effect. So it's not like, taking a sedative, but it's like if someone is anxious or they're overstimulated and they take reishi, it's going to help their nervous system adapt and calm down. But if someone is depressed and their stress response is like, inactive and they're in freeze, then again, reishi can actually, modulate up and have that adaptogenic effect and give them a bit more energy and a bit more kind of vitality.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you for explaining. And on this topic of reishi, whilst we're here, another area that reishi is sometimes used for, I believe, is for prostate health. Mm-hmm. Would you mind just explaining why the prostate, kind of how that all works?
So I think the main, effect or benefit for reishi is that anti-inflammatory effect, because of course reishi can be used either in benign prostatic hyperplasia or for prostate cancer. It is one of the key mushrooms in the Hifas it's called mycomen, the oncology product. It is one of the most potent mushrooms, and it's having a massive anti-inflammatory effect, and also, cellular oxidation. This effect of slowing the degeneration of cells and promoting them, maintaining their health and their patency is something that reishi does really well. So it's going to do that, for the prostate.
And you mentioned benign prostatic hyperplasia, just for our listeners, basically an enlarged prostate that's not cancerous. It makes complete sense. I don't know if this is exactly right, but I think I read that reishi reduces the production of the more potent form of androgen or male sex hormone.
Right.
Is that right?
That's also right. Yes, yeah. You're absolutely right.
So we talk about the androgens, basically the male sex hormones. The one everyone knows is, of course, testosterone. But testosterone is converted to a very potent form. And basically, when it comes to prostate enlargement, this is the one you don't want too much of. And what reishi is very good at, and thank you for clarifying, is that it reduces the conversion of testosterone to what we call DHT, which is the very potent one. So it makes sense even more mechanistically in terms of how that's working. But that's a great one. And I think what hopefully is coming across here is how, in a case, you're obviously looking at lots of factors in that individual's presentation. You're looking at their overall health, what their main concerns are, the main systems of the body that are under stress. And then you kind of will start to see in your mind sort of like, oh, this sounds like a reishi, or this sounds like, perhaps, I don't know, shiitake would be better, right? So there's different things, you're always ticking boxes. Is that almost what happens in your mind when you're trying to pick these?
Yeah, definitely. And the other thing that's important to remember is that mushrooms work really well in synergy. And, in traditional medicine, they would normally have been used either with other herbs or with other mushrooms. And so often it is that there's a specific mushroom that is going to be the most appropriate for a case. But as you said, people are, they may have many different things going on at once, and you're working with an individual. And so often, it's preferable to actually combine a couple of mushrooms. So you're actually getting, a broader effect, and they are going to work in harmony with each other.
So what other applications are there of medicinal mushrooms that we haven't yet mentioned?
Oh, there's a whole host of things. So, mushrooms, as long as a child has had them as culinary mushrooms, and that there's no allergy, they're something that actually also a good safe option for kids. And so we talked about gut health, but sort of allergies and food intolerances are quite common in kids, and that can be a really useful safe, easy something to add into a kid's diet to help with healing that. And because, as we've talked about, the prebiotic effect and balancing the gut microbiota, it also means that they can be helpful with normal, brain development and sometimes, behavioral issues or concentration, memory, issues can actually be to do with dysbiosis or a lack of certain good bacteria, and that's affecting mood or concentration or brain health. And, there's certainly evidence that mushrooms can actually be helping by, resetting the microbiota, are going to actually support better mood management and all of that in kids. So that's a really interesting.
It's really interesting.
Yeah.
And are there any particular strains of mushrooms that you might use more for kind of childhood, or it could again be any?
It could be any, sort of symptom dependent. But again, like often reishi and lion's mane are two really good ones because, we talked about it in terms of the, balancing the androgens and the prostate hormones. But actually, that's one of the other things that reishi does is it is a hormone balancer. And so that can be balancing stress hormones. It can be balancing, female menstrual hormones. So, it is one of those ones that's really a really good modulator on a lot of different levels. And so again, sort of, women's health and, hormone modulation is an area that, is another thing that mushrooms can do well.
So sort of fertility as well, can it support with?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, for fertility, there's probably a couple of other mushrooms that we'd bring in as well. So reishi is a really useful hormone modulator, and that's both for stress hormones and reproductive hormones. And so, if someone is having issues and there's a lot of stress involved as well, or there's irregular periods, then, reishi reishi would be a good one, or particularly if there's like pain and inflammation, reishi is going to be working in a number of different areas. But if, say, someone has something like PCOS, or they have blood sugar issues or weight issues, then something like maitake is really good at helping the body to regulate blood sugar and also regulating fat metabolism, although shiitake does that better. But maitake is kind of it's one of the main mushrooms we think about for metabolism. So if that's an issue that is affecting fertility, then certainly maitake is something that you would use for a period of time to help that person kind of get back into balance, maybe alongside, with reishi. And then the other one would be Cordyceps. And this is one that is really useful for both men and women for fertility. So it's known as the mushroom of vitality, or the mushroom of virility. And originally it was I think it was the Tibetan herders. They found that when their yaks were feeding in certain fields, they started getting all kind of frisky, and they were like, well, what is it in the grass that's getting them so frisky? And they started looking around, and like I said, the Cordyceps mushroom, they have this one phase which is just the mycelium phase, and then once spring comes, they feed on an insect, and then they actually shoot up, and they're like these little these kind of long fingers that then were in the grass. And so the yaks were eating these Cordyceps, and once they realized what it was, they started collecting it and of course using it for themselves. And so in traditional medicine, it's been known for virility and fertility. Wow. And now, unfortunately, there isn't much research on this, but the little bit that's there demonstrates that actually it can have an effect on basically, the cellular energy. It increases cellular energy, okay. And also it can increase cellular oxygenation. So of course, if you have either sperm cells or eggs that are just, not so healthy, if you can actually oxygenate them and increase the energy, then it means that it's actually going to promote healthier cells throughout the body, but also particularly in the reproductive organs. So for fertility, normally what you'd want to do is give, for a woman, at least 3 menstrual cycles, so a minimum of 3 months of treatment, ideally with Cordyceps, and if needed, maitake and or reishi, to kind of help get the body to a good level. And then you can start actually looking at trying to conceive. And same thing, with men, there's some small evidence of improving sperm, they call it morphology and motility. So that's the shape of the sperm, which needs to be a certain way so that they can swim well, and then their capacity to swim well. And they're actually using Cordyceps can actually improve that. So it's going to affect both male and female fertility.
Wow. And so does it also have an effect on libido? Does it increase libido? Yeah,
exactly. So it is considered a natural alternative for improving libido. And again, the nice thing is it's one that is for men and women, and not just something that is working with for men.
It's really interesting what you're saying actually about Cordyceps, and I've got some patients in mind now already where I'm thinking, I hadn't really thought about supporting some of those functions. So that's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Are there any other sort of key actions of Cordyceps that we haven't mentioned?
Yeah, so Cordyceps is a really interesting one. So as well as having that oxygenating and energizing effect, it's also a really potent antiviral. So it's something that is useful to consider either, therapeutically if someone, has a virus and you're wanting to support recovery, and also, preventatively. And it also has an affinity, so a tropism for certain organs in the body, and that would be the adrenals, the kidneys, and the lungs. And so it does also help with the regeneration of lung tissue, the oxygenation, but also because it's working with the adrenals and the kidneys, it can be, and that's, in terms of Chinese medicine, we'd look at that adrenal kidney energy as being related to the reproductive energy. And so in Chinese medicine, it's considered a kidney tonic and a qi tonic. So something that is going to build that virility and fertility, but also then thinking more physiologically, it means it's going to be supportive for fatigue, and particularly things like chronic fatigue, post-viral fatigue, where there's a real need for a boost. Cordyceps is something that I would consider in those cases like, worst end of the spectrum. But then at the other end of the spectrum, if you're a healthy person and you're taking something that's going to increase your cellular energy, increase your oxygenation, it's something that's great for people who are wanting to improve athletic performance. And that can either be, on the track or in the bedroom. Cordyceps is
well
going
explained.
yeah, but so it's one that actually, if you're healthy and you're wanting to actually just improve your performance or recovery, it's a really great one to consider.
Amazing. I actually saw, it may have actually been from Hifas that I saw the study, but I saw some research on Cordyceps in rheumatoid arthritis, because I think it was sort of explaining that from the research they'd found, which may have been extracts, I believe, from Cordyceps, that it reduced the enzyme production in joints in people that have rheumatoid arthritis, and the enzymes basically degrade the joint and cause a lot of inflammation. So it just goes to show, you've spoken a lot about a diverse array of functions, and obviously we're learning all the time what it can do. So it is very much a watch this space as well, isn't it, when we're looking at medicinal mushrooms?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I mean, Hifas did collaborate on a study with a Spanish organization which was looking at, at arthritis of the knee. And yes, so it was Cordyceps and Reishi together. And indeed, the Cordyceps working on those enzymes and the Reishi working on the inflammation and pain management. So yeah, really, then they're a really good synergy, those two.
Amazing. What about turkey tail? Because we've mentioned turkey tail already, very much in the context of cancer. You would explain that in Japan in the 80s, I believe, they had basically taken, I think it was 2 extracts, PSK and
PSK and PSP.
PSP, that's it. And these were basically patented, as far as I'm aware, so that they could then use them as a drug, pharmaceutical drug, basically. Is that the main action, the main sort of use for turkey tail in terms of cancer support, or are there any others that you might use turkey tail for?
Yeah, so particularly PSK, but, Coriolis PSP, is this antiviral effect. And so, again, looking at sort of risk factors for cancer, often there's actually, now they're sort of seeing, okay, there's actually viral, evidence of, virus in the medical history. And so they think that might be part, again, of, the effectiveness of turkey tail, because it actually reduces viral load. And so that's something that's really important to consider now when, we're kind of worrying about viruses. But it's also something for things like, for women, for things like HPV. So there is, potential there that, this is viral load that kind of builds up over time. And so there is some evidence there about, using Coriolis to help clear that and kind of, using it preventatively or therapeutically. And again, you want to make sure that those active compounds are present to get that antiviral effect. But really, we think of, Coriolis either being antiviral or sort of, oncology care. Those would be the main areas.
I think that mushrooms generally, if I'm not mistaken as well, have generally got an antiviral effect. I think even the culinary mushrooms, they increase what we call interferons, which basically stop cells from kind of helping viruses to replicate. Is that correct? Just to make sure I'm not mistaken there.
Yeah, I mean, there's different mechanisms that kind of come, but certainly that, sometimes they can interrupt viral replication. Sometimes, they're increasing, the immune system. Sometimes they're increasing, they can actually kill the virus and, deactivate them. So there's various different mechanisms. But yes, as you said, they do, can increase interferon. And that's true that, to a degree, again, part of the immunomodulating effect is having slightly antiviral and also antibacterial and even, antifungal, antiparasitic. So it's this kind of like whole broad spectrum effect. And then certain mushrooms are going to have, certain compounds that do that more. So shiitake we think of as being more antifungal, whereas Coriolis and Cordyceps we think of as being more antiviral. Reishi is kind of this sort of like, it does a bit of everything, so you could use it in any of these. And then another one, sun mushroom, so that's really useful for a little bit for viruses, but more for depressed immune systems. So those people who kind of chronically, like anytime anyone in the office gets a cold, they're going to be the one that gets it, and they just have like chronic infections that go on and on. Or those kids that are always a bit grizzly, it's like, sun mushroom is one of those ones. It has one of the highest levels of naturally occurring beta-glucans, those, key active polysaccharides. So it's really just a great one to boost the immune system.
I want to just draw upon a point there. You mentioned about beta-glucans. Now, in the supplement industry, beta-glucans are now being used more and more in terms of a supplement where they have been isolated and they're being used on their own. What are your thoughts on using beta-glucans in isolation?
Well, it's one of those difficult things, because there is certainly, evidence that beta-glucans are an active compound and they have a therapeutic effect. But there's certainly, I think one of the areas that, Hifas really looks at in terms of research is whenever they work with mushrooms, they want to look at the synergistic effect. And in the same way that, it took us a long time to realize that actually, if you have bioflavonoids with your vitamin C, it makes the vitamin C work better. Or if you have, you don't just want calcium, you want, vitamin D and vitamin K, it's like, and I think with mushrooms, there's a lot of interest, and so research is done on this one compound that we think does everything, but actually there's a synergy that happens, and so it might be that yes, this is going to have an effect, but actually in synergy with these other things that maybe haven't got so much research, they can actually be doing really important roles. And so by taking all of those things out, you're only getting this one or two or three benefits as opposed to maybe 20 benefits. So I would say ideally, you want to choose whole mushroom products. You want to choose mushroom products where the other active compounds are also being standardized. And it's not just that, people are just guaranteeing, one compound or an isolate, because, again, we don't really want to turn mushrooms into, pharmaceuticals or isolates. They are a natural medicine, and there is this harmony, within the mushroom itself. And a lot of other compounds, the terpenes, the polyphenols, there's a whole the sterols. There's lots of other ones that, we know that they do therapeutic things and that they are supporting, perhaps, beta-glucans certainly are the star, but there's actually a lot of evidence that, the terpenes, particularly the triterpenes, it's one of the most important, group of compounds in reishi. And so if you're just having a beta-glucan product, you're losing all of those other benefits.
So it's really interesting actually talking about this, because of course, I always think in nature, things are given to us in the form that they're generally intended to be used in, or at least they are in synergism with their different compounds generally for a reason. And it's often when we take one substance that we also end up with potential problems. Of course, if we think of the pharmaceutical industry, they might take salicylic acid from, a plant, let's just say from a herb, and that in isolation could lead to digestive problems like stomach ulcers. But if we actually go back to, willow bark, for example, where we get this from, there are actually compounds in the plant which protect the stomach from salicylic acid. So it's always interesting when we go back to the original form, it's generally there for a reason. And I imagine this a bit like a football team. If you've got a football team, you want a team of, English football, 11 players. You don't just want a striker. A striker is not going to get you the desired effects, because you want the synergism between all the different parts that work together. And as you've explained, we have, triterpenes in there, very powerful compounds. We have these beta-glucans. We have vitamin D. We've got all these amazing things, and ideally we want them to work together. So I think what you said there makes absolute sense. I completely agree with you. Just thinking practically for people listening who want to, let's just say they want to support their immune system, what would you recommend for them? What's the sort of thing that you would say as a take-home message for them to be using these mushrooms?
Yeah, so mushrooms, as we've said, a lot of culinary mushrooms actually have some active compounds. So I'd say, as a basic, eat mushrooms, and if you have a farmer's market or you have access to a place where they're going to have interesting varieties, like a lot of, I didn't really talk about, other varieties, but actually things like oyster mushroom is another one that people may be familiar with as a culinary mushroom. And that comes in, pink, grey, white, there's a whole range, and they all have slightly different active compounds. You can get lion's mane, you can get shiitake, you can get agaricus family. So eat mushrooms, that's the simplest thing that you can do, to have them in your diet. But if people are actually thinking, well, no, I want something that's, sort of standardized or, is going to get me a regular amount of certain active compounds, then I'd say if you are generally healthy and you just want something that's going to be supportive and preventative, then I'd say go for a blend, because then, the mushroom within themselves, like you mentioned, have this wonderful synergy. But when working together, often, the parts are greater than the whole. So actually having a blend, if you're not trying to target any specific thing, it's actually going to give you broader benefits than perhaps you're thinking of. And if you're not so familiar with mushrooms, you might not know which one to choose. Whereas if you go for a blend that is like an immunity blend, a digestive blend, a metabolism regulating blend, then it's like someone else has done the work for you and chosen the mushrooms that are going to address that need. And I'd say that's something that's really useful to do. And if you're generally healthy, you can just go for a whole powder product, a non-extract, and that is then giving you more prebiotics and some of the active compounds. But I would say look for a product that actually guarantees that you're getting some active compounds. If you see something that just says X% polysaccharides. So the polysaccharides, we've mentioned beta-glucans, but actually mushrooms have a lot of other, polysaccharides in their cell walls, and they're like the equivalent of, cellulase that you get in plants. So it gives the mushroom structure. It's going to have a prebiotic effect, but it's kind of inert in terms of therapeutic effect. So if a product just says polysaccharides, you don't know whether you're getting 30% beta-glucan, or you're getting 1% beta-glucan and 29%, bulking fiber that is just like the cell wall of the mushroom. So you want to choose a product that actually says X beta-glucans, X triterpenes, whatever else is in there. And if you actually are someone that, maybe has a compromised immunity or has food allergies or has metabolic issues, then maybe go for a concentrated extract and a blend that is going to be targeted towards that, that condition or stronger immune support. And, mushrooms are safe to take long term. So you can be taking 1 or 2 capsules a day indefinitely. And then if you have a particular condition, then you can go, okay, now I'm going to take a higher dose or specific mushrooms for that particular complaint, or, go and see a practitioner and they can guide you, about which to take or for how long. But they're really safe, and you can use them for your kids as well. Yeah. Get a kid's formula. You want one that's going to be dose appropriate, because kids are littler. So a liquid formula or a powder that you can kind of dose to their body weight. And that's a great, preventative and supporting healthy gut balance, healthy development.
That's great advice. And I like the idea of using powders. We used reishi powder. We sort of fluctuate between reishi and lion's mane, of course. And it's just easy. I mean, we make like a raw cacao hot chocolate, so literally just some cacao and some plant-based milk, and put some powder in, and it's you don't really taste much. I mean, you can taste a little bit with the lion's mane actually, but I quite like the flavour that comes through. But obviously you can add it to hot food, you can add it into your smoothie. There's lots of different ways that you could use powder, I guess. So yeah, lots of different ways we can use it. Now, just thinking a little bit more outside the box, what if somebody wanted to go doing some foraging for mushrooms? Is this something that you would recommend?
I would say if you're going to forage, you really want to, do your research and either find a foraging group or an expert, or, read some books and have a proper guide, because, there are actually a lot of poisonous mushrooms, and some of them can look like the edibles. So you really want to know what you're doing. So that's a kind of basic thing. And then the other thing would be you want to look at where you're foraging and how clean the environment is, because mushrooms are amazing. They're actually, they're kind of like sponges, not just in their texture, but also the fact that they will suck up not just nutrients from their environment, but if there are any heavy metals, any runoff, any pesticides, any, anything like that in the wood or in the soil, depending on what type of mushroom, they will suck that up. So they can actually be really useful for cleaning soil, or, getting rid of toxic waste. Mushrooms are sometimes used even for clearing up nuclear waste. But what it means is if you're collecting mushrooms in the wild, you want to make sure that where you're doing that from is not a place where there's going to be runoff from some farms and you're getting these lovely fresh mushrooms, but they're actually full of toxins. So I would say, with some research and guidance, foraging can be a wonderful thing to do. But if you're thinking about it from a health perspective, you just really need to know what you're consuming. They're
such a crucial part of our ecosystem, aren't they, when you think about it? And literally, you wherever you are, you're literally millimeters away from fungus, right? They're all around us. Listen, this has been such an interesting conversation. I really do love medicinal mushrooms. I love using them with myself, my patients, and to talk about it, for me has been great fun. I hope for our listeners it's been very interesting. I just thought a great way to finish the podcast would just be to hear from another little story of yours, a real standout from your experience working with medicinal mushrooms, and a great case, just sort of showcasing how powerful these are.
Yeah. So one case, and this wasn't, kind of like a big thing, but I thought it was a really kind of important thing. So I had a client who was sort of postmenopausal, and she, was kind of at that stage where her blood sugar was getting a bit high, her cholesterol was getting a bit high, and her doctor was kind of pushing for her to start taking medication. And she's someone who has always been chosen natural medicine and wanted to kind of do things herself. And so she got her doctor to say, look, let her have 3 months and see if she could bring any of her numbers down, and then, have the discussion again about, going on statins, etc. And so I gave her a medicinal mushroom blend designed for metabolism. So shiitake, maitake, reishi. And she did that 3 months of, taking this regularly. And when she went back and had her bloods again, I think that was pretty much the only thing she changed, because she was already taking a number of supplements, and her diet was quite good, although, a few things that were probably raising the blood sugar. And she wasn't fully back into, for her cholesterol, it wasn't fully back in the normal range, but it had gone down like 2 or 3 points just in that period of time, and her blood sugar had started going down as well. And it was enough that, her doctor said, okay, well, we'll talk about it next time. And so that was just really lovely to be able to support her in, her desire about how she looked after herself. And she wasn't, because we had already looked at sort of diet and supplements, she wasn't really having to make lots of extra changes. It was just adding this in, and it really, made a profound difference over just a few months.
Wow. And you can see, I guess, when that's pretty much the only thing you've added in, you can see the changes. They're very powerful things. Thank you for your lovely story. And thank you so much for your time, Hania.
You're very welcome. It's been a pleasure.